It's funny to watch cheaters who trade their family and many years of a happy marriage for money and more successful options. In this story, the protagonist's wife told him that she was leaving him and their children for a wealthy AP. But the protagonist didn't get discouraged. Instead, he came up with something interesting to teach the cheaters a lesson. Greetings, my dear viewer. Let's find out how the protagonist of this story taught the cheaters a lesson. And while you're watching this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit like. Let's go! The door clicked softly behind me, and at that very moment, a strange, unsettling feeling gripped my chest. The house was eerily quiet. No children's voices, no familiar sounds that Mary usually made. I set my briefcase down by the door and loosened my tie, the tension in the air thickening with every step I took deeper into the house. When I reached our bedroom, my feet froze. Mary stood before an open suitcase, hurriedly packing. The look on her face made my stomach twist. Calm, yet filled with a certain determination that felt out of place and frightening. Was that a faint smirk on her lips? "Mary, what are you doing?" I asked hesitantly, struggling to grasp what was happening. She didn't slow down or glance in my direction. Her hands moved faster, yanking clothes off hangers and tossing them into the suitcase with such urgency, as if I were missing something crucial. When she finally looked at me, her smile was cold, nothing like the warmth I'd grown used to over the past 15 years. "I'm making my life better," she said sharply, her voice filled with a chill that mirrored her expression. There was an arrogant tone in her voice that I didn't recognize. "I'm done with you and those annoying kids," she added, and the words hit me like a hammer. I stood there, trying to make sense of what she was saying. It felt senseless. My head spun, desperately trying to piece together what was happening. "What are you talking about?" I muttered, my heart pounding as disbelief and panic clashed within me. Without so much as a glance in my direction, she continued packing. "I'm leaving, Oscar. For good." Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. Another handful of clothes flew into the suitcase as she avoided eye contact. "I found someone better, someone richer, someone who knows how to treat a real woman." My head spun. "Better?" I barely managed to say. "We built a life together, Mary. We have kids. You can't just throw it all away." She paused for a moment and looked at me with an expression that made me feel insignificant, like I was too slow to understand the obvious. "Oscar," she sighed with irritation, "I deserve to be happy. And you? You were never enough." Her words struck like a slap, knocking the breath out of me. Was this really happening? Had I been blind to something all this time? How could the woman I loved, the mother of our children, suddenly become so distant, so heartless, as if overnight? I stepped forward, desperately trying to find some clarity amid the chaos in my mind. "We can fix this," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "If there's a problem, we can work through it. We've been through too much to just give up." She shook her head, an ironic smile flitting across her lips, as if my desperate attempt amused her. "There's nothing to fix, Oscar. It's been broken for a long time. I've just finally decided to do something about it." I opened my mouth, searching for words that might reach her, but she cut me off, her eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "I'm tired of you and your pathetic paycheck. And by the way, I've found someone else. He's richer, more attractive, and—" She leaned in closer, smirking as if twisting the knife deeper. "He's much bigger than you. You never measured up." Her words sliced through me like knives, deeper than I could have imagined. My fists clenched as I struggled to control the growing anger and humiliation. This wasn't about love anymore. It was about breaking me, tearing me apart piece by piece. My pride, my dignity, my worth as a man, a husband, a father. I stood there, my fists trembling, my heart pounding. "This isn't you," I said, my voice shaky. "What happened to the woman I married? The one who swore we'd get through anything together?" She didn't respond. The only sound in the room was the dull roar of an approaching engine outside. The headlights of an expensive car illuminated the room, stretching the shadows on the walls into long, distorted shapes. My stomach clenched as the harsh reality of the situation hit me, like being struck by a train. Outside, a shiny red luxury car smoothly came to a stop in front of the house, its tires softly rustling on the asphalt. Through the windshield, I could make out a man lounging confidently in the seat, radiating the kind of assurance that everything he came for was already his. Mary snapped her suitcase shut and slung it over her shoulder. "That's him," she said, a note of triumph in her voice. "Michael." She said his name like she'd just won a trophy, as if it was the reward for years spent in a life she evidently thought unworthy of her. I stood frozen, unable to move as she walked toward the door with her suitcase. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, and my hands trembled. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? The doorbell rang, sharp and mocking, cutting through the heavy atmosphere. Mary turned and gave me one last look, the corner of her lips curling slightly in a sneer. "Goodbye, loser," she spat with disdain. "You and the kids can figure it out on your own." She opened the door, and there he was, tall, smug, dressed in expensive clothes that screamed money. He looked at me with a mix of pity and superiority, as if I were just a useless remnant. "Tough luck, buddy," Michael said, his voice dripping with arrogance as he casually wrapped an arm around Mary's waist. "She's with me now. The kids? That's your problem. I'm doing you a favor." Blood boiled in my veins, my fists clenched of their own accord. Every fiber of my being screamed to act, to put an end to this nightmare, but I was paralyzed, standing on the edge of a life crumbling before my eyes. I took a step forward, my voice low and threatening. "If you leave with him, you'll never see the kids again. I'm serious. This is your last chance." For a moment she hesitated, and I dared to hope that maybe, just for a second, there was still something left in me of the man she had once built a life with. But her gaze met mine, cold, devoid of love. She shrugged indifferently and turned away. Without a word, she walked out of the house and got into the car, as if that was her new reality now. I stood there frozen, watching as Michael smirked while starting the engine. The tires squealed as the car sped off into the night, leaving only an icy silence in its wake. The house, once filled with the sounds of our family, now felt empty, an echo of what had been. I stared at the open door, my heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. She was gone. She had left me, the kids, everything we had built together. And for what? For a man with money and a fancy car? I collapsed onto the couch, my hands still trembling. The weight of it all pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. She was really gone. I had lost her, lost everything. Sitting there in the oppressive silence, a grim realization set in. I would never see her again. Her cruel words echoed in my mind. The roar of the car speeding away haunted me. Her face, distant, indifferent, lingered in my thoughts. The house felt cold and lifeless, and I knew the kids had heard everything. They were upstairs, likely listening as their mother tore our family apart. The thought of them witnessing all of this broke me completely. The weight of realization crushed my chest like a stone. I buried my face in my hands, trying to block out the whirlwind of images. Mary's cold indifference, her lover's smug grin, and the silent suffering of our children. Had all those years together, everything we shared, meant so little to her? Could she really walk away from all of it without a second thought? I sat motionless, unaware of how much time had passed. The house was unbearably quiet, steeped in the absence of everything I had once taken for granted. Our life, our family. I tried to make sense of it, to understand what had just happened, but it all felt so unreal. A barely audible sound broke through the fog clouding my thoughts. I lifted my head and saw my son William standing at the bottom of the stairs. He was only 12 years old, but his small figure seemed bowed under a burden too heavy for a child. At first, he said nothing, just stared at me with an expression that tore my heart apart. His eyes were wide, full of fear and uncertainty. But there was something deeper in them, something too mature for his age. It was a look that told me, in some painful way, that he already understood our lives had changed forever. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "is Mom coming back?" That question hit me harder than I expected, like a blow straight to the chest. I knew he already sensed the truth, but he needed to hear it from me. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words got stuck in my throat, tangled in the tightness I felt. How could I explain to him that the woman who had been our anchor had simply left? I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, knowing they would break him. "No, buddy," I finally forced out, my voice trembling with emotion. "She's not coming back." His reaction wasn't what I expected. There were no tears, no questions. He simply nodded slowly, as if he had already come to terms with the harsh reality. His small shoulders slumped for a moment, but then he straightened up, standing a little taller. "It's okay," he said, his voice calm, too calm for a child. "We don't need her. Right, Dad? We have each other." I was stunned by his words, by the quiet strength in them. It pained me to see him trying to take on a role he was too young to play, to be the man of the house when his world was falling apart. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him everything would be all right, but I didn't believe it myself. "Yes," I said softly, nodding. "We have each other." William walked closer and sat beside me on the couch. I pulled him into a hug, holding him close. His small body pressed against mine, warm but fragile. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, and it was just the two of us, clinging to each other in the silence. Then I heard soft footsteps behind us. I looked up and saw Susan, my 9-year-old daughter, standing halfway down the stairs. She was clutching her stuffed bunny, the one she always slept with, and her face was streaked with tears, filled with confusion and sadness. "Where's Mom?" she asked, her voice trembling. I felt William tense beside me and glanced at him before turning back to Susan. This was going to be even harder. How could I explain this to a little girl when I barely understood it myself? I gestured for her to come over, and after a moment's hesitation, she slowly made her way toward me. She climbed onto my lap, her small body shaking as more tears streamed down her cheeks. "Mom's not coming back, sweetheart," I whispered, each word tearing me apart. "She's gone." Susan buried her face in my chest, her sobs muffled against my shirt, which was already soaked with her tears. I held her tightly, feeling her small hands clutching me as if she were afraid I might leave too. I gently stroked her hair, whispering soft words of comfort, though I knew they wouldn't soothe her. "Why, Daddy?" she sobbed, her voice broken. "Why did she leave us?" I had no answer. How could I tell her that her mother had left for someone who had promised her a life of luxury, something we could never give her? It was a betrayal I wasn't ready to reveal. "I don't know, Susan," I whispered, my voice shaking. "But we'll get through this." "I swear," I forced out, though my voice trembled. She looked at me, her wide, pleading eyes searching for any kind of support. I tried to smile reassuringly, but my smile was weak, almost meaningless. William sat beside me, tightly holding her hand. "We're still a family," he said firmly. "We don't need her," he added bitterly, though there was still a hint of sadness in his voice. Susan wiped her tears and nodded, though her face was full of doubt. How could she believe him? Her world had just collapsed. The three of us sat closely together on the couch, pressed against one another in silence. I didn't know how long we stayed like that, but at some point the sobbing stopped, and the room was enveloped in quiet. But it was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence from before. This was something different. The silence of a family desperately trying to hold on amidst the storm, searching for anything to cling to. After a while, I stood up and gently suggested Susan stay where she was. "Let's think about dinner," I offered, trying to inject a little hope into my voice. "We'll figure this out, okay?" William nodded and stood, taking Susan's hand, and they both followed me into the kitchen. I opened the fridge, staring at its contents but not really seeing them. My mind was still consumed with thoughts of Mary, who had left us behind. But I pushed that thought away. My children needed me now more than ever. I pulled out some leftovers, trying to make the evening feel as normal as possible, at least for their sake. William and Susan sat quietly at the table, their eyes fixed on me, waiting for some kind of direction, for support I wasn't sure I could provide. But I knew one thing: I couldn't fail them. Not now. We ate almost in complete silence, the only sound being the clinking of forks against plates. From time to time I noticed William glancing at me, as if trying to figure out if I was holding it together. Susan clutched her stuffed bunny tightly, lost in her thoughts. When dinner was over, I cleared the table, my movements mechanical. Questions swirled in my head, questions I had no answers to. But one thing was clear: I had to be strong for them. They were all I had left, and I couldn't fail them the way Mary had. After dinner, I helped Susan get ready for bed. She was quieter than usual, still trying to process everything that had happened. As I tucked her in, she looked at me, her eyes filled with worry. "You won't leave us, will you, Dad?" she whispered, and her words pierced me like a blade. I leaned down, kissed her forehead, and quietly replied, "Never, sweetheart. I'll always be here." She nodded, hugging her bunny even tighter, and her eyes slowly closed. I stood by her bed for a few moments, watching her breathe, feeling the weight of our new reality. I couldn't fix what Mary had done, but I could choose how to move forward. I left Susan's room and found William waiting for me in the hallway. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with such seriousness in his eyes that he seemed much older than his years. "Things will be different now, won't they?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Yes, buddy, they will, but we'll make it. Together." He gave a barely noticeable nod in return, though I caught a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes before he turned and closed the door to his room behind him. I stood in the hallway for a while longer, and once again the house was filled with silence. But this time it didn't feel as overwhelming. I had my kids. They needed me, and that was all that mattered. Together we would find a way through this. Together, we would survive. The choice was inevitable. After Mary left, my life became a monotonous routine of strained pleasantries. I devoted myself entirely to caring for William and Susan, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of stability for their sake. But beneath all of this, something darker was brewing within me. Anger, simmering beneath the surface, a thirst for revenge that I couldn't shake. Mary didn't just leave me, she tore our family apart, leaving for a man who thought his wealth could replace the loyalty and love that we once shared. The betrayal itself was agonizing, but what burned me the most was their arrogance, the way they both acted as though I was insignificant. They would regret underestimating me. Every night I lay awake, haunted by her parting words and the smug expression on her lover's face. The anger consumed me, and I knew I couldn't just let it go. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about what they had done to our family. I had to make them pay for their actions. I couldn't let them walk away without consequences. It all started with a phone call. "David, it's Oscar. I need your help." David was my lawyer. He had helped me a few years ago when I bought our house. We hadn't spoken since, but I knew he wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. "Oscar, what's going on?" There was concern and professionalism in his voice. "Mary left," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "She left me for some rich guy. I want to file for divorce and get full custody of the kids." There was a brief pause before David sighed heavily. "I'm really sorry to hear that, Oscar, but you're in a strong position. You've been a dedicated father, and if she abandoned the family, that won't look good for her in court." "I don't just want custody," I said, feeling another wave of anger rise within me. "I want her to pay for what she did. Can you help me with that?" David's tone became more cautious. "Legally, we can take the necessary steps. But you need to focus on what will help in court, not on personal revenge. Let's concentrate on getting full custody, protecting your assets, and making sure Mary doesn't leave with anything she doesn't deserve." I took a deep breath, trying to control the rage boiling inside me. "All right, but if there's anything we can do to make her life harder, I want it done." "Understood," David replied, his voice restrained. "I'll start preparing the paperwork. We'll file for divorce and request an urgent custody hearing. We'll also need to gather evidence that she abandoned the family. It won't be easy, but I'm with you." After I hung up the phone, I didn't feel any relief. The legal proceedings would take time, and the thought of Mary and her lover enjoying their new life while I waited filled me with fury. I couldn't just sit by and let them think they had won. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, I found myself in front of my computer, unsure where to begin. Then I remembered Richard, an old friend who was a private investigator. We hadn't spoken in years, but this was exactly the kind of situation where his skills could come in handy. I scrolled through my phone, found his number, and called him. "Richard, it's Oscar." There was a brief pause on the other end before he replied, "Oscar? Wow, it's been years. What's going on?" "I need your help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady but firm. "It's about Mary. She left me for another man, and I need to know everything about him. Can you dig up anything on this guy? His past, his career, anything questionable in his background?" Richard's face changed, and his voice took on a more serious tone. "I'm sorry you're having to deal with this, friend, but yes, I can help." "Do you mean a full investigation? Personal life? Professional? Everything?" he asked. "Exactly," I replied, tension clear in my voice. "I need to know who he really is, and I want him to regret ever getting involved in this." Richard hesitated for a moment before responding. "Oscar, I'll do what I can, but be careful. This kind of thing can get out of hand quickly. If you're not cautious, it could backfire on you." "I don't care, Richard. They deserve everything that's coming to them." "All right," Richard reluctantly agreed. "I'll start looking. Give me any information you have." I gave him the little I knew: the guy's name, the fact that he drove an expensive red car, and a few vague details about his job that Mary had mentioned in passing. Richard promised to dig around and let me know as soon as he found something. The days blurred together: work, taking care of the kids, and anxiously waiting for news from Richard. Every time the phone rang or buzzed, a flash of hope sparked within me. Maybe this was the breakthrough I was waiting for. Almost a week passed before Richard finally got in touch. "Oscar, I found something," he said, his tone oddly casual, considering how important this news was to me. "What did you find?" I asked, sitting up in my chair. "His name is Michael Caldwell. He definitely has money. He runs an investment firm, but there are rumors of unethical activity. Nothing concrete, but enough to make him nervous if someone starts digging." My mind started racing. "Go on." "He's tied to offshore accounts, and there have been a few lawsuits that were quietly settled out of court. It's not enough to put him in jail, but if this becomes public, his reputation could take a serious hit. His wealthy clients won't like bad press." A spark of hope ignited inside me. This was exactly the leverage I needed. "Can we make this public?" "It's not that simple," Richard warned. "You can't just go public without solid proof. But if you want to rock his boat, we could leak the information selectively. It'll make his life very difficult." I thought about it. This wasn't just about getting back at Mary anymore. I wanted to destroy the life she had chosen over me. If I could strip away the luxury and security that Michael provided, maybe she'd realize just how badly she had messed up. "Do it," I said firmly. "Make them suffer." Richard agreed to move forward, and after we said our goodbyes, I leaned back in my chair, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start. Michael and Mary had turned my life upside down, and now it was their turn to face the consequences. While Richard worked on dismantling Michael's life piece by piece, I remained focused on the divorce and custody battle. David had filed the papers, and Mary wasted no time hiring a lawyer for herself. A fight was ahead, but I was ready for it. Every time I looked at William and Susan, I reminded myself that I had no choice but to win. Mary hadn't contacted me at all, not a word about the kids, no explanations, nothing. It was as if we had been erased from her life, like we didn't matter anymore. Her cold indifference only strengthened my resolve. If she thought she could walk away without facing any consequences, she was in for a rude awakening. As time passed, the tension mounted. Michael's business began to feel the pressure from the carefully planted rumors that Richard had been feeding into the right channels. I acted cautiously, just enough to make him slightly nervous. The changes became apparent when Mary, who had once constantly flaunted her new life on social media, began posting less and less. The bright, vibrant posts gradually disappeared, turning into rare and muted updates. That was the first signal that something was shifting, though they still didn't know what was coming. I wasn't even close to finishing what I had started. It all began so quietly, almost imperceptibly. Mary left our family for Michael Caldwell, a man whose supposed success was built on shaky ground. His business, which he was so proud of, was nothing but an illusion, propped up by rash decisions, shady deals, and partnerships with people just as questionable as he was. The cracks in his empire were bound to show eventually. But I wasn't just a passive observer. With the help of Richard, my trusted private investigator, I funneled key information to the right people. Competitors who were waiting for the slightest sign of weakness in Michael's empire, journalists eager to dig up a scandal, and most importantly, government agencies ready to scrutinize every aspect of his finances. At first, it was just hints and rumors planted in the right places, but soon, like a slow-burning fuse, it sparked a chain reaction that neither Michael nor Mary could have foreseen. One evening, as I sat in the living room after putting William and Susan to bed, I enjoyed the quiet. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I was sipping a glass of whiskey when my phone buzzed. A message from Richard appeared on the screen. It started, "You need to see this." Attached was a link to a news article. I clicked it, and the headline made a wave of satisfaction wash over me. Michael Group under federal investigation for fraud and embezzlement. A slow smile spread across my face as I scrolled through the article. The investigation involved Michael's shady financial dealings, offshore accounts, inflated profits, and dirty partnerships. His once thriving empire, a symbol of power and wealth, was now under intense scrutiny. It wouldn't be long before it completely collapsed. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the tension in my body ease slightly. This was only the beginning, but seeing Michael's world start to crumble was a satisfying first step. A few days later, the consequences hit him hard. Clients, spooked by the escalating investigations, began pulling their funds from his company. His so-called business partners, eager to protect themselves, abandoned him without hesitation. Michael was left exposed, his empire in ruins, and I knew that Mary must have been feeling the pressure too. I was right. A few days later, while shopping for dinner, I ran into Abigail, one of Mary's old friends. She seemed startled to see me, but quickly masked her surprise with a look of concern, something that resembled pity. "Oscar," she said softly, her voice careful. "How are you holding up?" I shrugged, trying to respond calmly. "I'm fine, just focused on the kids." She nodded, but her eyes darted around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "I'm really sorry about all of this. I've heard about Mary." Her words piqued my interest, and I raised an eyebrow. "What exactly have you heard?" Abigail hesitated for a moment, biting her lip before answering. "Well, people say things aren't going well for her. Word is that Michael's business is falling apart, and they're fighting a lot. Mary's not the same as she used to be. She's unhappy." A dark satisfaction crept into me as I listened to her words. Mary had made her choice, and now she was paying for it. "Has she said anything to you?" I asked more out of curiosity than genuine concern. Abigail shook her head. No, she's avoiding most of us. But from what I've heard, things are really bad. Financial problems, constant arguments. It's a complete mess. I thanked Abigail and left the store, my mind consumed with what was unfolding. This was just the beginning of the downfall I had set in motion, and there was much more to come. So it turned out to be true. Mary really chose to abandon her family for a man whose life was falling apart at the seams. The very life she had given up on us for was slipping through her fingers. At home, I sat at the kitchen table, watching William and Susan quietly absorbed in their coloring books, while my thoughts were occupied with what Mary had thrown away for a fantasy that was now crumbling right before her eyes. Was it fate or poetic justice? I couldn't say, but I felt no sympathy for her. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. That evening, after the children were fast asleep, my phone vibrated again. Another message from Richard. Michael was clearly in despair. He was selling off assets, trying to salvage whatever he could before everything collapsed completely. His downfall wasn't far off. I looked at the message, feeling a slow, satisfying sense of fulfillment starting to rise within me. Michael was sinking, and Mary was probably already realizing that she had tied her fate to a sinking ship. But financial ruin was only part of the damage. I knew the price was far greater, one that no amount of money could ever compensate. A few days later, David, my lawyer, called. "Oscar, I have good news," he said. Mary's lawyer reached out. It seems she's ready to discuss the terms of a settlement. She's backed off her demand for full custody and is now willing to agree to shared custody, he continued. I raised an eyebrow, surprised at what had caused her to change her mind so drastically. David chuckled. Looks like her dreams aren't as perfect as she thought. She probably wants to avoid a long, ugly legal battle, given that she's already got plenty of problems on her hands. You're in a strong position right now. If you want full custody, you could push for it and would most likely win. I considered it. The idea of full custody was tempting. After all, Mary had shown how little our children meant to her when she left us. But part of me wanted her to face the full weight of her decisions. With shared custody, she would have to confront what she had given up every time she saw William and Susan, knowing that she had traded them for a man whose life was falling apart. Let's stick with shared custody, I said after a pause. I want her to pay for her mistakes. David agreed, and we moved forward with the settlement. The next time I saw Mary was during a mediation session. She walked into the room, but she was no longer the person I had known. The arrogance and confidence that had once served as her armor when she left me were gone. Her face looked gaunt, her eyes lifeless, and the tension in her body told me everything I needed to know. Her new life was falling apart, and she was barely staying afloat. Michael didn't even bother to show up. Of course, he didn't. According to Richard, he was too busy trying to save his crumbling business. Mary was left to face the consequences of her choices alone, without the man for whom she had sacrificed everything. We exchanged only a few words during the mediation. Most of the negotiations were handled by the lawyers as they hammered out the details of the custody agreement. Mary couldn't even look me in the eye. Her previous stubborn resistance had vanished, replaced by a quiet, subdued resignation. When the session ended and we were about to leave, she hesitated at the door. For the first time since she left us, she spoke to me. "Oscar," she began, her voice quiet and fragile. I never thought it would end like this." I looked at her, seeing the regret etched on her face. For a moment, I saw the woman I had once loved, the mother of my children. But that moment quickly passed, replaced by bitter memories of her betrayal. "That's the problem," I replied, my voice cold and detached. "You never thought—" With those words, I turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the ruins of her choices. The life she had left us for was in shambles, and there was nothing she could do about it. But I wasn't done yet. Everything was falling into place. Michael's business was collapsing, His legal troubles were mounting, and his reputation was in ruins. But it wasn't enough. Watching his empire crumble, it wasn't enough for me. I was unwavering in my decision not to let him escape the consequences of his own choices. The final blow had to be personal, one that would hit him where it hurt the most. It was time to expose the affair that had started this whole nightmare. One evening, I sat at my desk, the only sound in the room being the soft hum of my laptop. The house was quiet. The children were peacefully asleep upstairs. I opened the emails I had spent days crafting, each one meticulously prepared for the people who mattered most in Michael's world: his business partners, major investors, and a few sensation-hungry journalists. With Richard's help, I had gathered a mountain of incriminating evidence: photos of Michael and Mary together, explicit messages leaving nothing to the imagination, and a carefully constructed timeline of their affair. This wasn't just about humiliating them. My goal was clear: to make Michael's colleagues and investors draw a direct line between his chaotic personal life and the reckless decisions he made in business. I wanted them to see how his irresponsible actions, like embezzling company funds for lavish trips with Mary, directly led to his financial downfall. For someone like Michael, reputation was everything. Once that was destroyed, there would be nothing left to save. With one click, the emails were sent. I knew the consequences wouldn't be long in coming. Within 48 hours, the news had spread like wildfire. Both gossip and financial media were flooded with headlines. Michael Group in chaos amid affair and legal scandal. The article exposed all the dirty details. It revealed the collapse of his finances, the federal investigation, and now the affair, which only worsened an already catastrophic situation. Investors started pulling their money, and Michael's business partners quickly distanced themselves from him. His once pristine public image was shattered beyond recognition. From a safe distance, I watched as everything fell apart, and with each new report, I felt a growing sense of satisfaction. It wasn't long before Mary came crawling back. I was at home, helping William with his homework, when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it, and there she was. There was no trace of the confident woman she once was. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen and red from crying. The smug expression she had left with was gone. "Oscar," she said in a trembling voice, "can we talk?" I looked at her, the betrayal flooding back like a wave. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, but another part was intrigued. What could she possibly have to say now? I stepped aside, letting her in. She walked into the living room, her eyes wandering around the room as if she barely recognized it. It had been months since she was last here, but nothing had changed, except now her presence felt wrong, as if she no longer belonged in this place. "The kids are upstairs," I said evenly. "If you've come to see them, I'll call them down." She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears again. "No, I came to talk to you." I stayed where I was, arms crossed, waiting for her to continue. She looked down at her hands, nervously twisting them. "I made a mistake," she whispered. "I didn't realize what I was leaving behind when I walked away from you. I thought I could build the perfect life with Michael, but everything is falling apart." Her voice cracked as she spoke. "He's not the man I thought he was. Nothing turned out the way I imagined. I was wrong, Oscar. I see that now. I'm so sorry." I stayed silent, letting her words fill the space between us. I wanted her to fully grasp the weight of her actions, to understand that the damage she caused couldn't be undone so easily. "You left," I said coldly. "You walked out on me and the kids without a second thought. For months we didn't hear a word from you. And now, when your dream life with Michael has crumbled, you come back here." I looked at her, feeling the anger still simmering beneath the surface. "What do you want from me? Forgiveness?" Mary broke down, collapsing to her knees, her sobs shaking her entire body. "Please, Oscar," she begged through her tears. "I know I hurt you." "I know that I hurt the children." At that moment, I didn't fully realize the consequences of my actions. I thought I could find something better, but I was wrong. You and the children are my real family. I want to come back home. Please, let me return. I looked at her, feeling only cold indifference. Once her tears could stir my emotions, but that time had long passed. She made her choice, and there was no turning back. "Mary," I began, my voice calm and firm, "you made your choice. Now you have to live with it. I warned you when you left. I said that if you walked out that door, there would be no way back, and I wasn't joking." Her sobbing grew louder as she tried to grab my hand, but I pulled away, refusing to accept her touch. "Please," she whispered, her voice weak and broken by sobs. "I've lost everything. I can't do this alone. Don't abandon me." I shook my head, remaining indifferent to her pleas. "This is what you chose, Mary. You left us for Michael. You chose wealth and adventure over your family, over the people who truly loved you. And now that it's all fallen apart, you want to come back? Life doesn't work that way." She collapsed to the floor. Her face was hidden in her hands, her body shaking with sobs. I watched her, feeling nothing. This was the same woman who left me, who humiliated me, who turned her back on her own children for a man who promised her luxury. Now, she faced the consequences of her choice. I turned away and walked toward the door. "You need to leave," I said softly. "There's nothing left for you here." Mary looked up at me, her face wet with tears, full of disbelief. "Oscar, please." But I stopped her before she could continue. I opened the door and waited. After a long silence, she slowly stood up, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. She looked at me one last time, as if hoping I would change my mind, but I remained steadfast. I stood firm, my face cold and expressionless. Finally, with a deep breath, she walked out of the house just as she had a few months earlier, but this time her confidence was gone. She was defeated, broken, and utterly alone. I closed the door behind her, the sound echoing through the quiet house. And just like that, it was over. The woman who once meant everything to me was now a distant, painful memory, a cruel reminder of betrayal and its consequences. I no longer felt anger or pain toward her, only a sense of closure. Mary had lost everything, and for the first time in months, I felt free. With Mary and Michael gone from my life, I found myself at a crossroads. The chaos they brought had left only devastation in its wake. But among the ruins, something had changed. For the first time in years, I saw a path forward, a life beyond the pain and betrayal. My focus narrowed to one thing: my children. It started with small things. Breakfast became a shared ritual again. William and Susan began helping in the kitchen, and together, we started to rebuild the rhythm that had been shattered by Mary's departure. William, now 14, had grown stronger and more mature because of everything that had happened. Susan, only 10, sometimes asked about her mother, but there was a maturity in her eyes far beyond her years, one that pained me every time she sought comfort. One morning, as I flipped pancakes on the stove, William sat at the table, immersed in his studies. Susan giggled at something her brother had said. For the first time in a long while, the house felt alive again. "Dad, can we have pancakes every weekend?" Susan asked, her face lighting up as I placed a fresh batch in front of her. "Of course," I replied, ruffling her hair. "Every weekend." It wasn't easy, but day by day we began to find our new rhythm. I fully immersed myself in fatherhood, helping with homework, driving the kids to practice, and spending long evenings watching movies we knew by heart. When they finally went to bed, I found myself thinking about the future, something I hadn't done in a long time. The pain of Mary's betrayal, which had hung over me like a cloud for so long, began to slowly fade. It wasn't a sudden change, but I could feel it happening. Then, On one of those quiet evenings, when everything seemed to be on the verge of change, I met someone new. Her name was Victoria. We met by chance at a neighborhood barbecue, an event I hadn't attended in years. I almost didn't go this time either, but William insisted. "Come on, Dad," he coaxed. "You never go anywhere anymore." So I went. Victoria and I started talking, first about our children, then about life in general. She had her own struggles, but what struck me the most was her warmth and ability to laugh despite everything she had been through. There was no pretense in her, nothing hidden or insincere. Victoria was real, a woman who had fought for herself and emerged from those battles stronger. Our relationship didn't begin with grand gestures or romantic acts. It developed slowly and naturally. It all started with small things: meeting for coffee after work, walks in the park while our kids played, late-night conversations about the madness of life and dreams for the future. A few months passed, and one cool autumn night, I realized I was beginning to feel something more. We were sitting on my porch, wrapped in blankets after the kids had fallen asleep, looking at the stars. Victoria glanced at me and said, "You seem lighter, more at peace." I smiled and nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." I turned to her and added, "You've played a big part in that." Her expression softened, and she met my gaze. "I'm glad," she whispered. "You deserve to be happy, Oscar." Her words touched me deeper than I expected. I hadn't thought about what I deserved in a long time. After Mary's betrayal, I had begun to doubt my worth, thinking maybe I wasn't good enough. But Victoria changed that. She reminded me what it felt like to matter. I gently took her hand. "I'm starting to believe that," I said. Over time, Victoria became an integral part of my life, and also the lives of my children. William, who was initially cautious, gradually grew fond of her. Susan, on the other hand, took to her immediately and constantly asked when Victoria would come over again. One evening after Victoria had left, William approached me in the living room. "Dad," he said a bit hesitantly, "you're happy with her, right?" I looked at him, a little surprised. "Yes, I am. Why do you ask?" He shrugged, lowering his gaze. "I just want you to be happy. You deserve it." A lump formed in my throat, and I hugged him. "Thank you, buddy. I really am happy." As my life moved forward, I heard from mutual acquaintances about what was happening with Mary and Michael. It seemed their lives were falling apart. Michael's business had gone bankrupt, and with that came legal troubles, which only worsened their relationship. Mary, who had left me in pursuit of wealth and excitement, was now reaping the consequences of her decisions. One day, while I was grocery shopping, I ran into a friend who knew both me and Mary. After a brief conversation, she leaned in and quietly said, "I saw Mary the other day. She doesn't look well. She's living with her parents since things with Michael fell apart." It turned out they had a huge fight, and Michael kicked her out. All I felt was a distant sense of inevitability. Mary had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. I didn't feel satisfaction from her troubles, just a quiet understanding of how things had turned out. This is how it was meant to end, and I calmly accepted that truth. As for me, I had already let go of the past. Victoria and I had built something strong, something real. The children were happier than they had been in the last few years, and I could feel myself beginning to heal. The bitterness that had once consumed me was slowly dissolving, little by little, day by day. One evening we all gathered for dinner, Victoria, William, Susan, and I, and a thought struck me. The life I was living now far surpassed the one I had stubbornly clung to in the past. It wasn't perfect, but it was genuine. It was built on love, untainted by lies or betrayal, but founded on trust, loyalty, and mutual respect. After dinner, when the children ran off to play, Victoria and I stayed behind, enjoying our wine and watching as the soft, golden light of the sunset streamed through the kitchen window. She looked at me with a gentle smile. "You know," she said, "I never thought I could feel this happy again." I reached out and took her hand. "Neither did I replied. In that quiet moment, something clicked inside me. Despite all the pain, betrayal, and heartbreak I had faced, I found something infinitely more valuable on the other side, a chance for a new beginning. I didn't win by trying to seek revenge on Mary or Michael. I won by restoring myself and finding love that was sincere and pure. As I sat there, holding Victoria's hand and listening to the joyful laughter of my children in the distance, a wave of peace washed over me. At last I had found serenity. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.